Welcome to As Long as the River Flows by Keepers of the Water. This is part 3 of our 4-part series on uranium mining. We are discussing health impacts. An important dialogue to start with the increasing uranium extraction happening in many territories. First speaker, Dr. Dewar, a published author and anti-nuclear activist since the 80s. She is an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. She is an active member of the International Committee of the Society of Rural Physicians of Canada and former executive director of Physicians for Global Survival.
I won't be limiting my comments to uranium itself, but to the health effects of ionizing radiation, which I'll refer to as radiation simply. When we're speaking of mining in northern Saskatchewan, we're speaking of the north as roughly being a line drawn across the map at this point, and the population of the northern Saskatchewan is roughly 90,000 people, of which probably 90% are Dene or Indigenous woodland Cree. Uranium mining is seen by the government in Regina as a cash cow. This is roads and likely communication systems have in the last half a century have been built around the uranium mining. And in the north, there are still many mines going on. There's Rabbit Lake, Cigar Lake, but what are the effects on the health and welfare of the north or on the miners themselves? The monitoring report in 2012 showed lower than expected amounts of uranium and most mining waste in the water and air near the communities of Camsell Portage, Uranium City, Fond du Lac, Black Lake, Stony Rapids, and Wollaston Lake, Hatchet Lake. The exceptions were molybdenum, uranium, nickel, and selenium from the Rabbit Lake mine in the runoff areas. To this date, no study has done, especially in the communities, in terms of looking at women or children in terms of absorption of these heavy metals. There have been many studies on the uranium miners themselves over the years, and the French study, which did it in 5-year allotments, is probably the most interesting, because what it does is it says back here in the 1950s, this is, believe it's 5 out of 100 miners developed lung cancer, whereas in the 1990s, it's 1 out of 100. And this is because of better ventilation, and also many of the mines have become surface mines, like open pit mining. Decay chain, this is uranium-238. This comprises 99.3% of the uranium that comes out of the ground. Doug mentioning that the radium and radon are the probably the most worrisome elements in the chain. We also have polonium-210 that is so toxic that the amount that's in a period at the end of a sentence in a newspaper was used to kill a Russian spy in, I believe, 2007. And he literally died on the newspaper headlines. We watched him go. Once the element has been taken into the body, like radium as a calcium substitute, it stays there. It's quiet, and if it was just any old element being picked up, it would be fine. But the thing with the radium or the radon is that it continually sends off little blasts of ionizing radiation, which can destroy the structures of the cells around them. So that the cellular structure, whether it's the genetic material, whether it's enzymes, whether it's something that even the color of skin can be attacked by these little blasts or bombs of energy and altered so that the cell does not behave properly and does not do the things that it was meant to do. It doesn't, if it's supposed to be producing enzymes, it may not produce enzymes. And I believe that it's correct that we should be doing more research on how this happens and whether or not there are increases in coronary artery disease or diabetes as a result of radiation from any of these elements or elements from other radioactive or energy from other radioactive elements that can cause cellular damage. We mentioned the likely culprit for the uranium miners' cancer is the radon, because it's always going to be accompanying any place that you have uranium. A concern for the future, however, is wherever there is mining tailings on the surface, there's going to be continued production of radon into the air. Radon is heavier than air and can be picked up by winds and travel as far as 1,000 kilometers from the site in which it's produced. The polonium is a solid and falls out of the air. So we have the radon changing into the polonium. The polonium can fall out of the air and land on plants, which are eaten by the animals in the north, or for that matter, can land on your sheets and pillowcases and clothing. Background radiation is the radiation that we find in numerous situations like the sun. We're told sometimes by the nuclear industry that because we're always exposed to background radiation, therefore we can tolerate radiation. And the fact is, no radiation is safe. And the fact that we're all exposed to radiation is no excuse to try and expose us to more. And we've talked about there's other illnesses that develop through intake of uranium, which is a heavy metal. With all the problems of any heavy metal, lead, mercury. In 1991, the first time I became interested in uranium mining and health, we had 4 patients that were diagnosed with lupus in a single year. Now, this is not a large population in Oelck. So that was a bit of a blip. We spoke to the rheumatologist, the specialist that deals with lupus, asking about why there might be, is that they noticed any connection to uranium, and they said no, this is just what they call a cluster. That's how researchers tend to describe odd groups out. However, that was 1991. In 2013, a Harvard study indicated that the estrogenic effect of uranium could result in more lupus in the males in the area. And that was the really odd thing about it, is that we had men with lupus. Back to how this ionizing radiation causes damage. We have alpha particles, which are somewhat large and don't go through the skin. We have beta particles, which can go through the skin. They're small, they're negatively charged, and they can go through the skin. But both of these can be ingested. And there's the problem. once they're ingested, they're next our biological cells. And while they're busily sending off their little packets of energy, they are ionizing, and that's what we mentioned before. So and ions are both how our body works, but also how it can destroy itself. We also have gamma rays, which are the same as X-rays. They can go straight through our body, but they leave a little trail of ions behind them. Sometimes cells recover. In fact, most of the time they do. Think of the number of people who've had many X-rays and have no sign of any kind of cancer that as a result of that. So we know that our bodies can do a certain degree of toleration. In fact, we know that because the cosmic rays, the sun's rays, can cause cancer. But most of us don't get cancer, and we just get sun damage to our skins if we live long enough. Besides the concern that I have over ionizing radiation in the north, I'm also very concerned about the medical use of ionizing radiation. I've mentioned X-rays, but there's also CT scans are much more, give much more exposure. And in fact, in the Canadian Medical Journal, there was a study showing that CT scans of children show an increase in cancers, solid cancers, in fact, and the increase is particularly noticeable once they have had 2 or 3 such scans. And for cancer sufferers, nobody would deny that using radiation has been a lifesaver for many people. But while it's killing the cancer, it can also affect the normal cells. There is an increase in secondary cancers for being treated with radiation, and it is about between 3 and 18%. And the big variation, it really means you can't say where you are on that unless you know exactly what the dose is and how it's being prepared or how it's being delivered and to which part of the body. And there's many ways in which ionizing radiation has been used for treating cancers. So in my conclusion, I'm going to say that we all have in our bodies, all of us born after 1945 have traces of strontium-90 and cesium-137 from the nuclear bomb tests and the nuclear power generation. And it's all part of as far as I'm concerned, an unprincipled industry that knew from the beginning that what they were working with was not good for human health. Thank you.
For over a decade, Douglas Brugge has directed the community assessment of freeway exposure and health. He is a professor and chair of the Department of Public Health Sciences at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. Has a PhD in cellular and developmental biology from Harvard University and a Master's of Science.
Uranium mining and health. Just to give you a little bit of context, for me, this journey really began in the mid-1990s when I joined with people in the Navajo Nation, and we did a project looking at uranium mines in that area. I'm going to talk more about the science and the health effects. This work started out being more about the social impacts and the negative effects it had on the communities out there. So the first thing to know about uranium is that uranium is a radioactive substance, and when it gives off radiation, it changes into another radioactive substance, and that is a long cascade of different elements that are all radioactive, ending with lead, And so uranium-238, there are multiple kinds of uranium, turns into thorium, protactinium, another version of uranium, then thorium again. And then the really important elements here are radium, which turns into radon. And the reason that radon is so important and so dangerous is it's a gas. Everything else on this sequence is a solid. And when radon gas is formed, it has a half-life of a little less than 4 days, which is enough time. If you imagine some radium in a uranium ore in a mine, and there's maybe it's in the rocks, so there's some cracks, that radon would have time to seep out, get into the air, and then when it decays, when it gives off radiation, it turns into a very fast, rapid series of what are called radon daughter products. And those are all solids. They're up in the air. They attach themselves to particles in the air. And the people who are around this radon will breathe it in. It can get deep into the lungs, depending on the particle size. And then once it's in the lungs, they're going to continue to give off this radiation, and they cause a huge amount of damage to the lung tissues. So this is a very, very well understood form of radiation and a health hazard, and the association with with lung cancer in particular is very, very well established. Sometimes we're dealing with environmental problems. We're not sure whether there's really a problem. This is an example of something where the evidence is completely convincing and has been for quite a long time. That these are increasing concentrations of radon in the air. This 4 picocuries per liter is the US EPA standard for radon exposure. And then what I've put over here are the number of people out of 1,000 that if they were exposed to this over a lifetime would develop lung cancer. So even at the federally regulated level, 7 out of 1,000 people would get lung cancer. Even below that level, some people get lung cancer. And as you increase the exposure, you get more and more people getting lung cancer. And these are in non-smokers. And when you look at smokers, it's far worse. Even at the federally regulated level, you'd have 62 out of 1,000 people getting lung cancer. If you get up here, where you're 5 times above that level, you would have about 1/4 of the people getting lung cancer from lifetime exposure. So radon is exquisitely toxic, very, very tiny amounts. I can't even tell you how tiny a picocurie is. These are very, very, very tiny amounts. They would be imperceptible. Radiation is imperceptible anyway, unless it's at massive doses. Imperceptible in the air, are quite harmful to health, all right? But notice also that it's over a lifetime, right? So we're not talking about if you're exposed to 4 picocuries per liter for 10 minutes that you have an appreciable risk. It's long-term high chronic exposure to these kinds of levels that are risky. The miners who worked in these mines were exposed to very, very high levels of radon, far above this level, for many of them for years or even a decade or more, and had very, very high risk of developing lung cancer. And one way of seeing that, of demonstrating how large the impact is, this is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act program, which is a US program. It resulted from advocacy of the Navajo people and other miners. It's been reformed. It's been revised a couple of times over the decades, passed originally in 1990. And as of about 2 years ago, they had approved compensation for almost 40,000. These are from the Nevada test site. So these are people who were downwind of the above ground nuclear tests. But lots of people, and you can imagine, this is a government program. There are very stringent, strict criteria you have to meet in order to get compensated. You can see they denied a large number of claims. So there are a lot of people who've been compensated, over $2.5 billion of compensation. a big chunk of that to miners, but also a lot to downwinders and on-site personnel. So it's just a very well-established risk, radon. Underground mining in particular results in very high exposures. There are other health outcomes besides lung cancer, but lung cancer is the one of most notable concern. But it's not just radon that we need to be concerned about in uranium mining. Contaminants, I mentioned radium is part of the uranium decay series. Radium is associated with bone cancer, head cancers, and leukemia. Thorium is in the list, but there's not much research on thorium. That's unfortunate. And then there are non-chemical contaminants like arsenic. I think people have heard of arsenic. Arsenic causes lung and skin cancer again, and skin cancer. It's a neurotoxin. It causes changes to the skin that change the pigmentation in the skin. And then there is just external ionizing radiation as well from these mines, which are associated with cancer, birth defects, and genetic damage. I would mention one other thing. It's going to stay there a very long time. However, if during pregnancy, when there's liberation of calcium from the bone for the developing fetus, then that's going to release whatever's in this bone as well. Lead from lead paint and leaded gasoline does the same thing. It deposits in the bone. Uranium itself is much more of a chemical toxin, a toxic metal. It's well established to cause kidney damage in animals. There's some evidence in humans that people who drink a lot uranium contaminated water have greater amounts of kidney damage. And then in the 1990s, 2001 timeframe, this researcher, Jose Domingo, who was in Spain, did a series of animal studies and showed that in a laboratory with animals that if you exposed them to uranium, you had death of the fetuses, you had reduced pregnancy, you had birth defects, cleft palate, and skeletal birth defects. And that was very early evidence of the risk of uranium. And at that time, it wasn't entirely clear, but I think it became increasingly clear over time that this is a chemical reaction, not a factor from radiation. There are some other studies. This is an oocyte, which is the egg, the egg that once it's fertilized becomes an embryo and grows into the fetus, leads to unnatural development and damage that is harmful to and prohibitive even of forming an embryo and developing further. This is a laboratory study. So Domingo's work was laboratory, and this is also laboratory. It's not people living in the world. Navajo researcher who published what I think is a very important study published in 2007 in the top environmental health journal. And what she basically showed in mice, this is also laboratory, is that uranium caused developmental changes very similar to, I don't know if people know DES, diethylstilbestrol, which was a drug that was given to women in the, I think, 1950s and 60s. Dale can probably correct me. And that led to a lot of birth defects and was taken off the market. So DES causes changes like this. Uranium causes very similar changes. And these are called estrogenic compounds. They have properties like estrogen, the female hormone, and having this external artificial estrogenic activity can lead to developmental changes that are adverse and negative. This is some other work also on the near the Navajo Nation in Northern Arizona University, showing chemical bonding of uranium to DNA, DNA being the genetic material. In recent years, the research has turned to the effects on communities. We're pretty clear that the miners had very high exposures, especially the underground miners, were at great risk of lung cancer. But what about the communities? They're drinking water that's contaminated. They live nearby the tailing piles from uranium. The children play near them. There's livestock that's feeding on feeding on plants that are growing in contaminated soil. How much of a risk is this? One of the early findings was that people in the Navajo area who lived closer to uranium contamination had elevated risk of kidney disease. That's not surprising, but the rest of this is was unexpected, which is hypertension and diabetes, and that these sort of come together as a collection of outcomes from the uranium exposure. I think this is not as clearly established and certain as the radon and lung cancer pathway, but it's of high concern. This is good work. I think there needs to be more work along these lines to sort of confirm this and make it more certain. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. I think the bottom line is that there is a range from radon and radium where we're very confident about the health effects, the harm to the miners, and then indications of risk to the communities as well that are not quite as well established, but the evidence has been growing and getting more convincing over time.
That was Dr. Dale Dewar and Douglas Brugge. Thank you for listening. If you want to hear the full webinar, visit the Keepers of the Water Facebook page or YouTube channel. And don't forget to rate us and subscribe. Miigwech.